Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jeff Resnick. I'm Chief of the History of Medicine Division here at the National Library of Medicine. Welcome to all of you and all of you who are watching remotely through NIH Videocast. It's my privilege this afternoon to introduce Dr. Bruce Fye as our Cassedy Lecturer for 2016. This lecture is named in honor of our late colleague, Dr. James H. Cassedy, renowned historian, 50-year employee of the National Library of Medicine, editor, bibliographer of the printed bibliography of the history of medicine and of its online counterpart, Histline. Dr. Bruce Fye received his BA and MD degrees from Johns Hopkins, where he was elected Phi Beta Kappa and Alpha Omega Alpha. He completed his medical residency at New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center in Manhattan before returning to Hopkins for his cardiology fellowship. During his tenure as a Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholar at Hopkins, he received an MA degree from the Institute of the History of Medicine at Hopkins. He chaired the cardiology department at Marshfield Clinic in Wisconsin from 1981 to 1999, and he joined the Mayo Clinic in 2000. Dr. Fye has authored over 100 historical papers and 3 books, including The Development of American Physiology, Scientific Medicine in the 19th Century, published in 1987, and his 1996 book, American Cardiology, The History of a Specialty and Its College, won the prestigious Welsh Medal of the American Association for the History of Medicine. Oxford University Press in 2015 published his book, Caring for the Heart, Mayo Clinic and the Rise of Specialization. Dr. Fye is past president of the American College of Cardiology, the American Association for the History of Medicine, and the American Osler Society. In addition to being a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic, he was the founding director of the institution's Center for the History of Medicine. Dr. Fye is now an Emeritus Professor of Medicine and the History of Medicine at the Mayo Clinic, having retired in 2014. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome Dr. Fye this afternoon, who will be speaking on the origins and evolution of the Mayo Clinic from 1864 to 1939, a Minnesota family practice, a Minnesota family practice becomes an international medical mecca. Dr. Fye, pleasure.
Thanks very much, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be back here and to have this opportunity to give the James Cassedy Lecture. Just show you a photograph of Jim in 1978. Actually, that's the year I got my master's degree in medical history. And he's, I won't dwell on this, but many of you would know what he was working on. But just a few career highlights. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but he did have an extraordinarily distinguished career as a historian, published very broadly, and of course known to historians for really helping to create and sustain the indispensable bibliography of the history of medicine for basically a quarter of a century. And served as president of the American Association for the History of Medicine, and once again published many things. He retired in 2006 from the NLM and died the following year. I just wanted to point something out. When I was given this very kind invitation, when Jeff invited me to give the lecture, I had known Jim through my involvement in the American Association for the History of Medicine. And when I was at Marshfield Clinic, I needed to do a little bit of what I would term strategic self-promotion in order to preserve the time that was given to me, protected time, to do medical historical research and publishing. And one of the individuals that I asked to write a letter was, in fact, Jim Cassedy. So I have this letter from literally a third of a century ago. I won't read it, but it's sort of a nice letter that he wrote recognizing a young and ambitious scholar who needed the support of a senior scholar, and I'm grateful to Jim for that. Well, today I'm going to talk about how America's first, largest, and most influential group practice grew up in Rochester, a small town in rural Minnesota. I begin with the birth of William Worrell Mayo in 1819 and end with the death of his 2 sons in 1939. Many things contributed to the creation of the Mayo Clinic, but 3 were essential: a family of ambitious doctors, an order of Catholic sisters, and the advent of hospital-based surgery. William Worrell Mayo, the founder of the practice, was born near Manchester, England in 1819, 1 week after the future Queen Victoria was born in London. Mayo studied with Manchester chemist John Dalton, but he did not become a doctor until he moved to America in 1846. After arriving in New York City, he spent several months mixing medicines at Bellevue Hospital. Mayo moved west in 1847, settling first in Lafayette, Indiana, where he worked as a tailor. 2 years later, he became an apprentice to Elizur Deming, one of the state's leading doctors. Deming taught at 2 medical schools, and Mayo got degrees from both of them, the Indiana Medical College in LaPorte in 1850 and the University of Missouri in St. Louis 4 years later. The school term was only 4 months, so he spent most of his time practicing with Dr. Deming in Lafayette. Mayo married Louise Wright in 1851, and they moved to Minnesota 3 years later. Minnesota was still a territory when the Mayos and their infant daughter settled in St. Paul, thought of as a flourishing city of 9,000 on the Mississippi River. Louise opened a hat shop to help her husband as he drifted away from medicine in the face of stiff competition. In 1856, they moved to Le Sueur, a village on the Minnesota River, where the doctor started a practice, and his wife delivered 2 more daughters and a son. William James, or Will Mayo, was born in Le Sueur shortly after Abraham Lincoln's inauguration and the outbreak of the Civil War. In 1863, President Lincoln appointed Dr. Mayo examining surgeon for Southern Minnesota's Enrollment Board that was headquartered in Rochester. The following year, he moved his family to the thriving town and started a practice. When Mayo began practicing medicine in Rochester in 1864, the 10-year-old town had a population of about 3,000. Further growth was assured because 2 major transportation networks intersected in the city. Many wagons carrying goods and people passed through the town each day on a trail that stretched between St. Paul and Dubuque, Iowa. In 1864, the Winona and St. Peter Railroad reached Rochester, linking it to North America's expanding rail network and a busy steamboat stop on the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, a steady stream of settlers passed through Rochester on their way west. Louise Mayo delivered her last child, Charles Horace, or Charlie, shortly after the end of the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln's assassination. In the 1870s, the Mayos built a big home in Rochester and bought a farm just outside town. Will and Charlie grew up watching their father practice medicine. Typical of the time, neither one attended college before they enrolled in medical school. In 1883, just before Will graduated from the medical department of the University of Michigan, he told his sister, "Don't let father work too hard. When I get home, I will give him more time to run the farm and rest, for I am anxious to get out and put my shoulder to the wheel for the common good. I am in love with my profession, and with hard study and work, with plenty of time, hope to make a success." Charlie Mayo graduated from the Chicago Medical College in 1885. Neither brother did an internship before they joined their father's practice, but they took advantage of a new educational model. They enrolled in summer courses at the New York Polyclinic and the New York Postgraduate Medical School. Beginning in the late 1880s, they took turns traveling to Chicago and other cities several times a year to watch leading surgeons operate. The main reason the Mayo brothers traveled so much was that they were determined to transform themselves from general practitioners into surgeons. Dr. Mayo had a regional reputation as a surgeon when his sons joined his practice, but he operated infrequently, and when he did, it was in his office, a patient's home, or a hotel room. Will and Charlie would benefit from a new science and a new model of care in the late 1880s. The new science of bacteriology provided a conceptual framework for the introduction of antiseptic and aseptic surgical techniques, which were designed to reduce postoperative infections. At the same time, hospitals were changing from static structures that sheltered the poor and dying into dynamic spaces where trained nurses cared for the sick and doctors performed surgery. Johns Hopkins Hospital surgeon Howard Kelly published photographs of his operating room in 1890 that showed a steam sterilizer for instruments and other anti-infective paraphernalia. From a patient's perspective, antisepsis and asepsis weren't about smelling carbolic acid or seeing bacteria through a microscope. They reduced the risk of putrid wounds and death. Will and Charlie were early adopters of aseptic surgical techniques, and importantly, they had a place to use them. Hospitals would be the centerpiece of the so-called new surgery, a term that referred to more invasive procedures in the abdomen and elsewhere that were made possible by the introduction of aseptic techniques. Around the turn of the century, hospitals sprang up in small towns all across America. Between 1873, when Will Mayo reached adolescence, and 1911, when his father died, the number of hospitals in the United States increased 20-fold to more than 4,000. In 1889, the Mayos were presented with a career-changing hospital as a result of a deadly disaster and the visionary Catholic sister. 6 years earlier, a local newspaper reported, "Last Tuesday at 7 o'clock, Rochester was one of the loveliest cities in the West. 10 minutes later, its beauty had disappeared. A terrible cyclone visited us, leaving death and destruction in its track." Well, the tornado killed more than 24 citizens and injured dozens more. Dr. Mayo and other physicians treated trauma victims in a makeshift hospital set up in a dance hall. Some of the injured were taken to the Academy of Our Lady of Lourdes, a private school run by the Sisters of St. Francis. Mother Alfred Mose, who led the local congregation, looked beyond the catastrophe. As Rochester began to recover, she told Dr. Mayo that her sisters would raise money to build a hospital if she would take charge of it. The 64-year-old general practitioner was skeptical, but Mother Alfred persisted. A decade later, he recalled their conversation. "Some weeks after the temporary hospital closed, the Mother Superior came down to my office and asked, 'Doctor, do you not think a hospital in this city would be an excellent thing?' I answered, 'Mother Superior, this city is too small to support a hospital.' I told her that the erection of a hospital was a difficult undertaking and required a great deal of money, and we had no assurance of its being a success even after a great deal of time and money had been put into it. 'Very true,' she persisted, 'but you just promised me to take charge of it, and we will set that building before you at once. With our faith, hope, and energy, it will succeed.' I asked her how much money the sisters would be willing to put into it, and her reply was, 'How much do you want?' 'Would you be willing to risk $40,000, I said. 'Yes,' she replied, 'and more if you want it. Draw up your plans. It will be built at once.'" Dr. Mayo's initial reluctance to accept Mother Alfred's offer is understandable, given the time and place. In 1883, there were just 6 general hospitals in Minnesota, and 5 were in the Twin Cities. When St. Mary's Hospital opened in 1889, it had 45 beds and an operating room. It was a success from the start. The hospital's first report, published in 1893, shows that Will or Charlie Mayo performed 655 operations with a mortality rate of less than 2%. The sisters, who had been teachers, were taught how to care for patients by Edith Graham, a trained nurse who married Charlie Mayo in 1893. By this time, word was spreading about the brothers' surgical skills and the sisters' compassionate care provided to all, regardless of resources or religion. Men and women traveled to Rochester from ever greater distances as train tracks fanned out across the prairies and beyond. The Mayo brothers considered accurate diagnosis a critical step in achieving superior surgical results. Between 1895 and 1905, they recruited a dozen doctors who specialized in clinical or laboratory diagnosis. Henry Plummer, the son of a general practitioner in a nearby village, joined them in 1901, 3 years after he graduated from Northwestern University Medical School. Plummer would devote himself to diagnosis and to systematizing the practice. The Mayos had just moved into new offices in the first floor of the Masonic Temple, where their custom-built space included several examination rooms, a laboratory, a dark room for x-rays, and a surgical dressing suite. Many patients experienced modern medicine, for the first time in this building, where diagnosticians used various technologies to examine their bodies and bodily fluids. The Mayo practice grew rapidly as a result of word of mouth among the public and more formal communications among physicians. By the turn of the century, the brothers were becoming known nationally for performing so many major procedures with so few deaths. Visiting doctors, impressed by what they saw, became effective emissaries. Johns Hopkins surgeon Harvey Cushing visited Rochester in 1905 with other members of the newly formed Society of Clinical Surgery. He told his father, a retired physician in Cleveland, "The Mayos have built up a wonderful operative clinic and are well protected by an able staff of internists, specialists, etc., and are little likely to make mistakes. They do as good and as much surgery in their own particular lines as any other 2 men in the world. It has become worthily quite a mecca for medical men." Meanwhile, the public began reading about surgery and the Mayo practice in magazines and newspapers. In 1905, journalist Samuel Hopkins Adams proclaimed, The hospital of the Mayo brothers is the most remarkable surgical institution of its kind. It handles more surgical cases annually than any institution in the United States, including the great Johns Hopkins Hospital. This wasn't an exaggeration. The 1905 reports of St. Mary's Hospital and Johns Hopkins support his statement, despite the fact that Rochester was a town of 7,000 and Baltimore had a population of 500,000. The Mayo practice became even better known when Will became president of the American Medical Association in 1906. When his term ended the following year, tens of thousands of doctors knew his name and hundreds visited Rochester each year to watch him and Charlie operate. Several visiting doctors published impressions of surgery at St. Mary's and the office-based system of diagnosis. In 1906, a Canadian physician coined the phrase, "the clinic in the cornfields," to describe the unlikely context of the Mayo practice, which he called the most unique, elaborate, and scientific clinic in the history of medicine. Small-town general practitioners and prominent urban surgeons traveled to Rochester to watch surgery and to have surgery. For example, Will operated on Johns Hopkins surgeon Howard Kelly in 1911. When Kelly took the train west for gallbladder surgery, William Osler, the former physician-in-chief of the Johns Hopkins Hospital, reassured him, writing, "The Mayos have great success with their professional brethren." But Kelly didn't need reassurance. He confided in his diary, "Will Mayo informed any inquirers that I came here because of the season and that my Baltimore colleagues were away. I told him that he was my preference under all circumstances." Ordinary patients also considered Rochester a special and a safe place for surgery. Their postcards described their social and medical experiences. In 1909, an Iowa woman informed a friend, "Everyone is so nice. I've been examined and they say appendix and perhaps gallstones. They'll see when they take the appendix out, but I don't dread it much. The doctors here are so far ahead of them there that it don't amount to much. They take from 4 to 6 minutes to operate for appendix." Efficiency was a recurring theme in reports from Rochester. The Canadian doctor mentioned earlier used a mechanical military metaphor to describe his impressions in 1906. "All parts of this vast Mayo machine move with the regularity and precision of well-disciplined troops. When one has seen the various activities centered here, the degree of excellence to which the diagnostic methods are carried, the extreme pains which the large staff of specialists take in their various departments, and the masterminds controlling this huge machine, he can understand why the hotels and boarding houses of Rochester find it difficult to accommodate those who seek relief." This physician pinpointed the philosophy that distinguished the Mayo practice, a group practice, from all others a century ago when he wrote, "Specialization and cooperation, with the best that can be had in each department, is here the motto. Cannot these principles be tried elsewhere?" Will Mayo discussed the dynamics of specialization and the advantages of group practice in a 1910 commencement address in Chicago. One of his main messages was that doctors must think of each patient as a whole person, despite progressive specialization. Will's words, spoken to new medical graduates a century ago, provide such valuable insight into the conception of the Mayo Clinic that a long quote is justified. "The sum total of medical knowledge is now so great that it would be futile for one man to attempt to acquire a good working knowledge of any large part of the whole. The very necessities of the case are driving practitioners into cooperation. The best interest of the patient is the only interest to be considered, and in order that the sick may have the benefit of advancing knowledge, union of forces is necessary. The first effort made to meet the situation was in the development of clinical specialties. Man was divided for treatment into parts, as a wagon is divided in the process of manufacture. Each part of man was assigned to those who could devote special attention to their particular portion, giving the benefit of superior skill in treatment. Unlike a wagon, man could not be treated in parts, but only as a whole. So it became necessary to develop medicine as a cooperative science, the clinician, the specialist, and the laboratory workers uniting for the good of the patient, each assisting in the elucidation of the problem at hand, and each dependent upon the other for support." 4 themes that Will Mayo emphasized, specialization, cooperation, technology, and modernity, were embodied in the new building the practice occupied in 1914. Designed by internist Henry Plummer and a St. Paul architect, the big building reflected the success of the Mayo's homegrown model of multi-specialty group practice. It contained a large waiting room, more than 30 combination office examination rooms, and several laboratories. Richard Beard, a member of the medical faculty at the University of Minnesota, wrote, "The building as a work of art, science, and service is as complete as anything that modern medicine has yet achieved." The day the building opened, 1,500 people walked under a limestone lintel with Mayo Clinic carved in large capital letters. This simple two-word phrase signaled a shift in the name of the practice, but it also represented a new definition of the word clinic. Traditionally, the word clinic referred to a recurring, hospital-based teaching event. It followed the name of a specific doctor who taught in a ward or an amphitheater. In these teaching clinics, a surgeon would demonstrate a procedure on a cadaver or operate on an anesthetized patient, and a physician would interview or examine a patient. The audience of students, residents, or practitioners varied from a few to a few hundred individuals, depending on the institution, the purpose, and the professor's popularity. Philadelphia artist Thomas Eakins memorialized the surgical amphitheater model in his painting, The Agnew Clinic. Doctors who visited Rochester before the new building opened in 1914 used the term Mayo Clinic in this traditional sense to describe a teaching event. Visiting doctors stood in a small operating room gallery at St. Mary's Hospital, where they watched Charlie or Will perform surgery and listened to them explain what they were doing and why. After the outpatient building opened, the phrase Mayo Clinic no longer referred exclusively to these teaching events. It now identified a special place that embodied a novel concept, a group practice that united patients with several types of specialists who were supported by a large staff. Will and Charlie worked hard to impress visiting doctors who watched them operate, but they knew that most practitioners learned about their practice from publications. Articles conveyed information, but they could also help establish an academic reputation. In 1907, the Mayo brothers hired Maud Mellish to organize a library and to edit manuscripts. She edited the annual volumes of the collected papers that were first published in 1911. The title of this series was changed in 1914, the year the new building opened, to emphasize the new meaning of the phrase Mayo Clinic. At this time, the group practice included more than 30 physicians, surgeons, and scientists. There were 10 interns at St. Mary's Hospital, and 24 more doctors were pursuing specialty training in Rochester. Many papers published by staff members and trainees were illustrated with photographs and drawings. Between 1904 and 1911, Will Mayo failed in several attempts to recruit Max Broidel, America's best medical illustrator. When Will hired Eleanora Fry, an accomplished Brooklyn artist, he sent her to Baltimore to study with Broidel. Her spectacular drawings emphasized and exemplified the Mayo brothers' commitment to excellence and education. American medical schools came under increasing scrutiny during the first decade of the 20th century. There were no medical students in Rochester, but Will Mayo was very familiar with his state's facilities for training doctors. Governor John Johnson had appointed him to the University of Minnesota's Board of Regents in 1907. 3 years later, educational reformer Abraham Flexner dissected every North American medical school in a scathing report prepared for the Carnegie Foundation. He called Chicago the plague spot of the country in terms of medical education and pronounced just 3 of the city's 14 schools fit to train doctors. But Flexner heaped praise on the Mayo brothers' home state, writing, "Minnesota is perhaps the first state in the Union that may fairly be considered to have solved the most perplexing problems connected with medical education and practice." When Flexner's report appeared in 1910, there was just one medical school in Minnesota, and it was an integral part of the state university. Sociologist George Vincent moved from the University of Chicago to become president of the University of Minnesota the following year. One of his interests, the training of medical specialists, would have profound implications for the future of the Mayo Clinic. Historian Guy Ford, the dean of the University of Minnesota Graduate School, visited Rochester in 1915 to evaluate Mayo Clinic's academic potential. When he toured the new building, Ford was impressed by the library, laboratories, pathological museum, and medical record system. He wrote, "The richness of this material, not seen by the casual visitor, furnishes opportunities for graduate medical work in certain lines, such as can be found nowhere else on this continent, nor probably in the world." Meanwhile, there was increasing evidence that the Mayo Clinic was more than a well-organized surgical practice. Edward Kendall was hired in 1914 to establish a research program in biochemistry. On Christmas morning, he isolated an iodine-containing compound in crystalline form that was the active principle of the thyroid gland. Kendall's discovery of the hormone thyroxine was hailed as a breakthrough that exemplified the growing relevance of the basic medical sciences to clinical practice. The affiliation between the University of Minnesota and the Mayo Clinic that was proposed in 1915 made sense from the standpoint of training specialists in a well-staffed hospital with high patient volumes. Understandably, some Minnesota doctors felt threatened by the prospect of their state university bonding with America's most successful private practice. Charles Green, head of the university's medical department, rallied the opposition. He wrote a 6-page editorial that opened with a sentence that revealed his frustration. The proposition under discussion conveys to the affiliate body, a private corporation, an amount of prestige, power, authority, rights, and privileges such as are without modern precedent. The president of the university, the dean of the medical school, and others who favored the affiliation fought back. Will Mayo, an influential regent, played an active role despite what several individuals saw as a conflict of interest. The architects of the affiliation concluded that its critics would be disarmed if a new entity was created that was distinct from the Mayo Clinic. The Mayo Foundation for Medical Education and Research was incorporated in February 1915. 1 month later, Mayo pathologist Lewis Wilson went to Minneapolis to explain the purpose of the new foundation to university alumni, several of whom were hostile to the proposed affiliation. Wilson had spent 10 years at the university before moving to Rochester, where he pioneered intraoperative frozen section diagnosis in 1905. When he spoke to the Minnesota alumni a decade later, the national movement to reform physician education focused on medical schools. Wilson emphasized that the Mayo Foundation's main purpose would be to establish a higher standard for training specialists. Wilson said, "Specialism has become an inevitable necessity, but the training of the specialist is today one of the most difficult problems in medical education." The Mayo pathologist told the Minnesota alumni something they knew. Doctors could call themselves specialists regardless of their training or experience. He parodied how some self-proclaimed specialists prepare themselves for practice. Like the hurried businessman, they rushed to the European lunch counters, bolted ready to serve specialties, keeping one hand on their pocketbook and both eyes on the clock, and then rushed home again, hoping to digest the meal on the return trip. Usually they've regurgitated these meals undigested, rarely have they assimilated them. The escalating European war had already disrupted opportunities for continental study when the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915 shut down transatlantic travel for aspiring specialists. 1 month later, the Mayo Foundation partnered with the University of Minnesota to expand the Rochester-based 3-year postgraduate training program that stood in stark contrast to Wilson's caricature of a common shortcut to specialization. Applicants for a Mayo Foundation fellowship must have graduated from college and an acceptable medical school and have completed an internship. Once enrolled, they were required to spend several months in areas complementing their chosen field. For example, surgical fellows devoted a year or more to pathology and general diagnosis. All Mayo fellows were expected to do research and encouraged to publish papers. 2 philanthropists established the Mayo Foundation for Medical Education and Research in 1915 with a $1.5 million gift. They weren't titans of industry or commerce. They were the sons of a small-town general practitioner. Will and Charlie Mayo had made fortunes as surgical virtuosos. The new building was just one visible sign of their spectacular success. But how did the Mayo brothers get so incredibly rich when the average doctor earned about $2,000 a year? Basically, they were 2 of the very best surgeons in America. New York surgeon Robert Morris explained in 1911, "Every surgeon of established position has cases coming to him from all over the country. The patients often accompanied by their physicians, diagnosis all made, ready to pay liberally for the work." Will and Charlie's assets paled in comparison to the enormous fortunes amassed by the likes of Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Nevertheless, their $1.5 million gift to endow the Mayo Foundation in 1915 placed them in the front ranks of philanthropists eager to encourage the reform of American medical education. The Mayo brothers' donation, equivalent to $32 million today, matched the amount that the Rockefeller-funded General Education Board had given to Johns Hopkins 2 years earlier to launch the full-time salary system for clinical professors. But the full-time plan at Hopkins provided salaries for just 3 professors of medicine, surgery, and pediatrics, and a handful of their junior assistants. Johns Hopkins, like all traditional academic medical centers, would continue to rely almost exclusively on part-time faculty who earned their income from private practice. The Mayo Clinic, on the other hand, implemented and maintained a different model. Beginning just after the turn of the century, every doctor added to the clinic staff was a full-time salaried employee. This salary strategy was a critical factor in the clinic's stability and success. The creation of the Mayo Foundation for Medical Education and Research in 1915 attracted the attention of leaders of academic medicine. The following year, Lewis Wilson told Francis Peabody, an internist on the staff of Boston's Peterbent Brigham Hospital, "We thoroughly believe that neither research nor routine diagnosis and treatment can reach high watermark without the other." After Peabody visited Rochester, he wrote, "The professional opportunities and the facilities for doing the best type of modern medical work at the Mayo Clinic made a profound impression on me. I'm more firmly convinced than I had expected of its permanent place in the development of American medicine." During World War I, Will and Charlie developed potentially fatal illnesses that led them to contemplate what the Mayo Clinic and Foundation would be like without them. Will survived severe jaundice, and Charlie recovered from pneumonia. In 1919, they transferred ownership of all the clinic's buildings, equipment, and other assets to a new entity, the Mayo Properties Association. Staff members were told that the purpose was to endow an organization for generations, and now I'm quoting, "in which medical and surgical treatment may be had by anyone, without regard to financial status, race, color, or creed, all meeting on a common level." Another section of the memo emphasized Mayo's academic mission. A prominent feature of the work of the clinic in the future, as in the past, will be scientific research as to the causes of disease, its prevention and cure, and not least, advanced education for physicians and surgeons. Surgery fueled Mayo Clinic's economic engine, but after the war, more internists were hired to expand clinic-based diagnosis and hospital-based medical treatment. In 1919, William Osler published a letter proclaiming the maturation of internal medicine, the specialty he had helped conceive. The former Johns Hopkins professor declared, "The surgeons have had their day, and they know it. The American St. Cosmos and St. Damien, the Mayo brothers, have made their clinic today as important in medicine as it ever was in surgery. Wise men, they saw how the pendulum was swinging." 2 years later, Will Mayo told a medical society president, "A large number of the brightest young men are now taking up internal medicine." The world-famous surgeon said, "Medicine has been in a state of flux and is now passing from the stage of pills and powders into a new conception of internal therapy based on physiological processes, biochemistry, and physics." Henry Plummer led the clinic's diagnosticians during the first 2 decades of the century. In 1920, Will Mayo hired Leonard Roundtree, a Johns Hopkins-trained pharmacologist and internist, to establish a major program of clinical investigation. When St. Mary's Hospital opened a huge surgical building with 300 beds and 11 operating rooms in 1922, Roundtree's group of internist investigators took charge of 150 beds in a renovated wing. The creation of a medical department at St. Mary's was very significant because the hospital had been devoted almost exclusively to surgical patients for a generation. After World War I, more patients drove to Rochester, taking advantage of better roads and cheaper cars. Most still traveled by train, however, over a dense network of tracks that connected cities, towns, and villages across the continent. When patients and visitors arrived, they found themselves in a place that revolved around health care. By 1925, the clinic employed almost 800 people, including physicians and fellows. Several hundred more men and women worked in Rochester's hospitals that were staffed exclusively by Mayo Clinic doctors. At any one time, 450 nurses and 400 nursing students provided care to more than 1,000 inpatients. Mayo's leaders made an effort to address certain social aspects of a patient's medical experience. Will Mayo said in 1924, "The clinic should aim at all times to deliver to each patient the same type of service that a member of the staff would desire and insist upon for his own family." Employees were coached on conduct and expected to follow rules. The Mayo Clinic desk book was a detailed staff guide with chapters on facilities, departmental functions, and operational procedures. The 1927 edition was 101 pages long and began with aphorisms to mold attitudes and influence actions. Remember, A call from a patient takes precedence over personal engagements. Neglect of a patient means that you are in the wrong profession. A smile at the right time can often alleviate the sting of a bad prognosis. Taking a personal interest in each patient is good for the patient, the clinic, and yourself. A littered desk means lack of system, therefore a waste of time and effort. The Mayo Clinic provided personal care, but it was managed like a big business. Behavior was monitored, and everyone was expected to act professionally. In 1923, the Board of Governors discussed tensions in the operating rooms at the new Colonial Hospital. Their minutes were blunt. If the surgeons of the clinic expect to have efficient service in their operating rooms, they must conduct themselves so as to win the respect and confidence of their operating room staff. This cannot be accomplished by prima donna temperament, cursing, nagging, or displaying irritation while operating. Technologies were central to the Mayo practice, and they too were controlled. The daily newsletter announced in 1928, telephones in the clinic building are for business calls only. Due to the fact that there are between 8,000 and 9,000 calls daily, it is requested that absolutely no social calls be put through between the hours of 8:30 and 5:30 p.m. This huge call volume was just one measure of how big and busy the Mayo Clinic had become. Patients crowded the halls as they underwent a series of evaluations, a protracted process known locally as going through the clinic. In 1924, a woman informed a friend in Iowa, "Clark started taking his examinations today. It takes 3 or 4 days to take them all. Just wish you could have seen the people in line this morning waiting to register. 3 lines and over 30 in each one." The outpatient practice outgrew the 1914 building in just a dozen years, prompting Henry Plummer to propose a much bigger one. In his own compulsive way, Mayo Clinic's chief diagnostician and systematizer designed, redesigned, and refined plans for the building that would eventually memorialize his name. Plummer's main mission was to develop a floor plan to promote efficiency, but he also wanted to create an artistic masterpiece. He achieved both goals. Although the new 1928 building was small compared to the towering monuments to commerce shooting up in New York City, it was a skyscraper in Minnesota. More than 1.5 million bricks covered the outside, and more than 2,000 radiators heated the inside. The building's size exemplified the mismatch between the number of doctors in Rochester and the city's population. When it opened, Rochester had more than 10 times as many physicians per capita as Baltimore or Minneapolis. This fact reflected Mayo Clinic's reputation and its enormous geographic reach. 1 year after the new building opened, the stock market crash in New York triggered an economic tidal wave that swept across the country. The clinic imposed across-the-board salary cuts in 1930 as its income plummeted. When Will Mayo spoke to the staff in August, however, he emphasized the plight of the patient. "We must meet him halfway, and not by more severe methods of collection add to his great distress. We must adjust accounts, both past and present, to his ability to pay. We must send out not collectors, but adjusters. We must not sacrifice the ideals of the clinic because of temporary inconvenience to ourselves." During the early years of the Depression, patient visits fell dramatically. St. Mary's Hospital, totally dependent on the clinic for business, experienced a 50% drop in admissions between 1928 and 1931. Will Mayo expressed cautious optimism in the spring of 1933 when he told a British surgeon, "We seem to be lifting out of the Depression." Shifting his gaze to the political landscape, the clinic's chief strategist explained, "We've gained all the advantages of a dictatorship by peacefully passing the burdens into the hands of President Roosevelt, an excellent man, giving him the right to use various methods of starting the wheels going, and the general outlook at the present time is encouraging." Patriotism permeated Rochester in August 1934, when the president rode through town sitting beside Charlie and Will. He came for an American Legion ceremony celebrating their service to the nation. The Washington Post proclaimed, "Some 25,000 persons from all over the state gathered at Soldiers Field for the ceremony, honoring 2 men who, starting as country doctors when Rochester was a village, built up a medical center that is one of the marvels of the world." President Roosevelt's visit animated the city, but the real news was that local medical businesses were beginning to recover. For the first time in 4 years, patient visits at the clinic increased. Charges also rebounded from $4.3 million in 1933 to $5.5 million the following year. Because Mayo doctors saw fewer patients during the early years of the Depression, they had more time for research and writing. In 1934 alone, they published more than 600 articles. The Wednesday evening staff meetings, held in a big room in the new building, were well attended and provided regular opportunities for cross-disciplinary discussions. For example, biochemist Edward Kendall informed the group in 1934 that he had isolated an adrenal cortical hormone in crystalline form. Will Mayo praised the accomplishment, telling the audience, "Dr. Kendall is still a young man, with scientific imagination, dreaming of new discoveries in the difficult field of chemistry. The clinic justifies itself not only in what it does for sick people, but in bringing forth those discoveries which aid in advancing medical science." Eventually, Edward Kendall and rheumatologist Philip Hench would share the Nobel Prize for their roles in the isolation and clinical use of cortisone. In the early 1930s, the Mayo brothers stopped operating and resigned from the Board of Governors. The committee structure they had established shortly after World War I was functioning well, and a new generation of leaders was in place. The fact that these doctors and their successors were selected from the Mayo staff rather than recruited from elsewhere helped maintain institutional traditions and a stable sense of purpose. As the decade drew to a close, there were several signs of success. Will and Charlie Mayo, with the help of the Sisters of St. Francis and others, had transformed Rochester into a unique medical destination. Time magazine reported in 1938 that a 26-year-old woman traveled more than 1,500 miles to Mayo from a village in British Columbia. It wasn't the distance that was newsworthy. She was the 1,000,000th patient to register at the clinic since the sequential numbering system was initiated in 1907. By 1939, more than 1,500 doctors had done residencies at Mayo. They came to Rochester from all over the continent and from overseas, having received their medical degrees from more than 75 institutions. Several medical schools were especially well represented among the residents in Rochester, including Mayo's academic partner, the University of Minnesota, and the Mayo brothers' alma maters, the University of Michigan and Northwestern. A large number of fellows also came from the University of Chicago, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Toronto. When Charlie and Will Mayo died 8 weeks apart in 1939, scores of tributes appeared in medical journals and the popular press. Harvey Cushing praised their altruism and accomplishments. The pioneering neurosurgeon and Pulitzer Prize-winning author said, "The modern world is all too accustomed to gauge success in terms of net income." Cushing juxtaposed this observation with something that Will Mayo had said in 1915 when he and his brother endowed the Mayo Foundation. "We never regarded the money as ours. It came from the people, and we believe, my brother and myself, that it should go back to the people." In 1938, Will and his wife donated their large home to the Mayo Foundation to become, in his words, a meeting place where men of medicine may exchange ideas for the good of mankind. Cushing cited another physical structure in his eulogy. He described the Mayo Clinic building as a living memorial to a great idea. The multispecialty group practice model was invented in Rochester at the beginning of the 20th century. The Cleveland Clinic, founded in 1921, was modeled after the Mayo Clinic. Will spoke at the dedication of their first building, and Charlie gave the keynote address at the opening of their hospital. Surgeon George Crowell, one of Cleveland Clinic's founders and the Mayo brothers' longtime friend, wrote to Will after Charlie died in 1939. Reflecting on the past half-century, Crowell said, "I would never have dreamed in the inaugural stages of this period that there would be such an institution as the Mayo Clinic, the greatest achievement that has been made in the world of medicine." Crowell's effusive praise reflected his affection for the Mayo brothers and his enthusiasm for the group practice model. During the 76 years since Will and Charlie died, the Mayo Clinic's physical appearance has changed enormously, but its purpose and philosophy have not. For a century, the Mayo Clinic's main mission has been providing state-of-the-art patient care in an environment enriched by productive programs of postgraduate education and research. And I want to thank you for this opportunity to share a bit of Mayo Clinic history and in honoring Jim Cassedy. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer questions if there are any. Vicki.
Bruce, as I listen, the first question is, these people seem to be unique. Why weren't there many more of these kinds of clinics established as modern medicine was coming out? Was it just the individual brothers, or is there another explanation?
Well, I do think there are certain unique factors in the individuals, and especially in the context. It's isolation, remote distance from other medical contexts where they would face competition. But in fact, many of their residents, and they call them fellows, but they functionally were residents, went off and started group practices around the country, especially in the Northwest, quite a number in the South, and obviously a number in the Midwest, where the proximity facilitated that. Many of those smaller practices actually were just wiped out in the Depression. It was a matter of the sort of the idealism of group practice confronted the realism of the financial catastrophe that struck the country, and so many of those smaller groups really just met their demise in that context. Then the other thing that happened sort of during the middle third of the century was that the notion of group practice sort of got confounded with prepaid medical plans and prepaid care and socialistic medicine. And so that was another thing that sort of dragged down the model, which really had nothing to do with the mechanism of payment, had everything to do with collaboration among physicians and proximity and facilitating patient care through, again, facilitating access to specialists and making it easy for the specialists to communicate about a given patient in a short period of time in a specific space. If there aren't any other questions, I will just show you something that I think is a little bit interesting. Many of you will be familiar with the title of this book, The Doctor's Mayo. It was published in 1941 by the University of Minnesota Press, and the author was Helen Clapesaddle. Her picture is up on the upper left. So I joined the Mayo Clinic in 2000. My mother died 13 years earlier. You're going to see why this is relevant in just a moment. So my mother was born on a farm in Pennsylvania, as my wife's mother was. They both went to one-room schoolhouses until the 9th grade. I'm not entirely sure how my mother's parents, who died before I was born, got enough money together to get her to Oberlin College, but she was in Oberlin during the Depression. And in 1933, there's an entry in her diary, the Phi Beta Kappas were announced yesterday in chapel. Helen Clapesaddle was one of the juniors to receive the honor. I'm proud to be her friend and co-worker in the kitchen. Well, I read this after I'd gone to Mayo Clinic, and I almost fell over because my mother had never mentioned anything to me about Mayo Clinic or Helen Clapesaddle, despite the fact I started as a pre-med at Johns Hopkins in 1964 and moved sort of along that pathway. So it was intriguing. The next thing that's interesting is most individuals are alive because their ancestors didn't get a potentially fatal illness. I'm alive because my maternal grandfather did, in fact, get a potentially fatal illness. My maternal grandmother was born in Denmark, and you see the picture on the left. She's the one with the arrow over her head, and these are her 4 siblings and her mother. Her father had already died in some kind of accident, and her mother died shortly after this picture was taken, so there were 5 orphaned children, and 3 of them came alone to the United States and were raised by an aunt and an uncle who'd already come from Denmark and were living in Connecticut. So my maternal grandmother then went to nurses training in Meadville, Pennsylvania, where I was born, and you see the hospital up on the top, and below there with the arrow is pointing to my maternal grandmother after she was a nurse. My maternal grandfather had a farm in western Pennsylvania that's been in our family since the 1850s. It's still in our family. And he got typhoid fever, along with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century. So the fact that he got typhoid fever led him to meet a Danish-American nurse, and that led to a marriage that resulted in my mother's birth. So there's my mother with her mother and my mother with her father, again, neither one of whom I ever knew, but I thought it was sort of a coincidence that was probably worth noting if time permitted. So once again, thank you so much for coming and allowing me to have this honor.